Hi, Prof.
When else of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains.
So I'm going to ask some questions about racial capitalism and also organized abandonment.
See, you've got to be careful what you say because then someone might ask you to explain it someday.
Why is it important for us to understand that you cannot undo capitalism without undoing racism?
Capitalism requires inequality, and racism enshrines inequality. So, while racism might have originated in a variety of places outside the capitalist system, the fact is that capitalism is extremely syncretic, and the imperative depends on inequality. And in the entire social order of the world, as it has developed and changed and rebelled under capitalism, we see over and over again that the requirement of inequality becomes manifest through racism. So racism will not go away without capitalism, even though capitalism might die before racism. We have to fight them together.
Thank you so much, Prof. That's a really helpful answer. And it also helps me with the second question that I had. So I'll quote you here. You say that the relationship between slavery and race and unfreedom, and unfreedom and labor is one that we constantly try to untangle. And at our peril, we ignore it. But also at our peril, we make it too simplistic. So I'm going to ask then, please can you take us through the relationship between unfreedom and labor?
So there is, in the sort of classical sense of how capitalism works, the fact that labor depends on capitalism to be able to express itself energetically, to be able to reproduce itself socially. Labor's unfreedom is disguised by an apparent freedom, which is that a worker can just go work somewhere and then leave when she wants to. The second thing is to understand that the unfreedom of slavery that was intended for the extraction of labor does not necessarily correspond identically to the unfreedom of not enslaved labor in its dependence on capitalism. The third part is that in the entire history of the world, practices of slavery in many societies were not determined by the necessity to extract labor. People had slaves in order to have prestige, and the Mamluks were a slave caste that ruled Egypt. So we cannot assume slavery only is social relation out of which uncompensated labor is extracted. And that brings us to the fourth and final point. In the world today, there are about 7 billion people. All of those people are not, in terms of their capacity to labor, necessary for capitalism. And yet, capitalism can extract from those people all kinds of other things by virtue of the people being. In the United States, the various prison systems have the largest number of people officially locked up anywhere. Most of those people are not doing anything except for losing the one resource that can never be replaced: time. The extraction of time from their lives itself is monetized. It turns into jobs, buildings, courts, police, civilian staff, social workers, medical workers, cities that have infrastructure and utilities that serve the prison. And not one person who's locked up has to do anything except be locked up for that to happen. So while we must make and do things to flourish on this planet, we have to figure out how effectively, campaign by campaign, to separate our understanding of the exploitation of labor, which is real, from the exploitation of human life, which is also real, but not necessarily always attached to labor.
How then do we impactfully contribute to the entangling of these relationships between slavery and race and freedom of labor?
We do it in large part by looking closely at the struggles that people are already engaged in and paying attention to the analysis and insights that people bring to the struggle, and then open a way for people who might, for example, be fixed on the notion that unfreedom in the form of prison is about labor extraction, to say, have you thought about time? And if we think about time, we consider what path the remedy will take differently, i.e., if people say we're going to end prison slavery and it turns out nobody in prison is working, then prison slavery will have been ended without prison being ended. My definition of racism is the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. It's about time, but it's also about group differentiation. So bodies as groups of people, but then obviously the individual human, not a matter of Black versus white or white versus everyone else. It's any kind of group differentiation that goes through this grinding process of vulnerability. I had a comrade for many years in Los Angeles who was a member of the Black Panther Party. He fought the police, he lost an eye, and it was so long ago, before the police in the United States became so indemnified against any challenge to their organized violence, that he won a case, he got a little bit of money resource, and he continued his activism. His name was Michael Zinzun. He asked himself, well, people die at the hands of police, but what else is killing our people? Shortening lives, producing some of the inevitable results of vulnerabilities that precede those encounters with the police. And so he thought about, among other things, the lung disease that especially afflicts poor young children in both urban and rural areas around the world. Now, you might have heard that a landmark case was just decided in the UK about the death of a little Black girl, maybe 11 years old. She had extremely, extremely severe asthma, and she eventually died of it. This is something that shouldn't kill anybody, and it kills a lot of people. Her mother was not a scientist, and people who came together around the mother, who have been fighting for environmental protections for vulnerable people living in London, kept asking questions. And finally managed to persuade a judge that the nearby highway with trucks and so forth put so much particulate matter in the air that those environmental hazards killed the child. Michael Zinzun, 30 or 40 years ago, was already following that line of reasoning. Zinzun realized very early on that freedom fighting, while necessarily going up against the police and against capitalism in general, would also have to be green. It would have to have this environmental quality in a radical way in order to make it possible for vulnerable people as they fight to have the life through which they can fight. Another example, which I call red, so this is back to labor as a formal category, has to do with the kinds of worker organizations that people have managed to maintain, even in the face of brutal suppression, as happened with the mine workers in South Africa, as happened with many different kinds of workers around the world. There is, as you probably know, an uprising now on the part of farmers in India. There have been strikes and demonstrations on the part of healthcare workers all over the world. So the red part of the puzzle is to think about how these various campaigns, how those struggles connect. And then again, to offer through conversation and comradely debate ways to think the path as broadly as possible. And so both of these examples enforce the necessity of internationalism to have an impact and also to have the kind of solidarity we need to get to the next day of the struggle.
Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but to change.
Wow. You kind of answered the next question which I would have had, which was actually on vulnerability. And you caution against reciting vulnerability as a way to influence or persuade people into action, like preaching a message of doom. I was really interested because this is one of my problems, I have to admit. I'm interested in farm workers' rights as a daughter of a farm worker and a domestic worker. And often what I do when I talk about it, when I write about the struggles of domestic workers, I do spread a message of doom. I genuinely did not know how to show the vulnerability and the injustices and the inequality without painting that kind of picture to say, look, these people have been here for several generations working, and they've died here. You know, my great-grandparents was buried on the same farm, and my father worked on the same farm for 12 years and moved to a different one for a better salary, and then my mother still works there as a domestic worker. And in many ways, my struggle has been to say, how then can we talk about these struggles without reverting back to vulnerability, to persuade people into action.
I think you have heard me talk about not only the problem of the relentless focus on vulnerability, but the huge failures that many of us had over the years by walking into a space and saying to people, all of you are doomed. Any questions? Like, what? Why would anybody do anything but slump in their seat and hope that you leave really soon? Like you, I come from a family that worked in service, and then my father worked in a factory instead of pushing a broom as his father had done. But the continuity between them was not that my father's job was better than his father's, but that they perceived the opportunities for organizing differently because the conditions of their work were different. So both generations organized. And the story of progress, why grandpa was a custodian and daddy was a machinist and I am a professor, is not that at all. It's just we work in different contexts and have different opportunities and obligations to understand what we do and change the world. But I want to make a kind of more general point that we make abolition geographies. We make them by bringing talents and ideas and interests and solidarities and rituals together in a moment when the undoing of something which is only the beginning of abolition, enables the presence of what abolition is to come fully into our practices. So the way I put it is, abolition is life in rehearsal. So when I think about, for example, to go back to the United States, the experience of what Du Bois called the Negro worker during Reconstruction, or think about people who live in the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza. When I was there 31 years ago, I saw that people in manufacturing, in agriculture, in healthcare, in women's committees, were all doing work to be able to rehearse and rehearse again without ever having a final curtain. And for all of them, ending the occupation was still only going to be the beginning. It's totally relevant, but it isn't the only thing. It's also true for the PAIGC in the long revolution in Guinea-Bissau. And I learned about this from the brilliant Sonia Bosch-Burgish, who is a researcher at Humboldt University. And the PAIGC had, before they started the hot war, developed an entire plan for education, school books, buildings, so that many of the soldiers had also been trained to be teachers. So as the zones were liberated, some would stay behind to build the school and then provide education for adult and children learners, because they had absorbed and renovated fundamental principles of historical materialism. They understood that their revolution would be made, but not under conditions of their own choosing. However, one of the key elements would be to make it possible for people who were participants in or bystanders of the revolution to become active members of the new society being made, i.e. rehearse abolition of colonialism. So they figured out how to use already existing colonial textbooks, but do the kind of critical reading so that you could read a textbook that says you're nothing and realize how it's saying you're nothing tells you everything that you actually are, or have new textbooks, which also had been produced over time. And Cabral had a huge mind and also a great humility about him. He also, and this is key, I think, he was an agronomist. And he walked the land. He walked the land in Guinea-Bissau. He walked the land of Cabo Verde. He walked the land here in Portugal. And he understood and helped other people understand the variety of social and cultural forms that people lived in the various regions of Guinea-Bissau that then could be hailed to the revolution if they were engaged in the kind of we will build together way that that revolution tried to achieve. So these are some of the kinds of ways to think vulnerability, as it were, inside out.
Thank you so much for that response. It's so rich. I'm getting a lot of help and relief, and you've helped me think, as you're telling the story, to think that actually in your family there's so many other stories that are not about, the fact that you're the daughter of a farm worker and a domestic worker. There's just so much more. But there was another question I wanted to ask, and it relates to organized abandonment. And I'm going to paraphrase here, Prof. You argue that there are very many ways through which we can think about organized abandonment and the implications of that. But that thinking should bring us to think about how state, municipal, greater, and capital, large and small, work together to raise barriers for some kinds of people and lower them for others. And you also talk about forgotten places. I'm interested to know what forgotten places are and how you paint that relationship between forgotten places and organized abandonment.
It might be, if I were to rewrite that essay, Forgotten Places and the Seeds of Grassroots Planning, I might have chosen a different title, but I'm going to be loyal to my younger self because what I learned from reading work by many people who studied, in particular, rural societies that had once been very important hinterlands for more urban centers, then when that importance faded, they became, as it were, forgotten. But of course, the people there didn't forget themselves. So it was kind of a long way for me to get from having thought about organized abandonment earlier to going through forgotten places to kind of returning to organized abandonment and thinking that is, for me, the more powerful way to think about relationships. Organized abandonment produces the experience of having been forgotten or left out. Two of the people who helped me think most productively are Abdul Malik Simon and Edgar Peterson. So they wrote a book called New Urban Worlds. The urban part is not, for me, necessary for using their analysis to think about the world. What Edgar and Malik teach me is to look at a situation, a social formation, a built or even crumbling environment, not as one to be fixed, but rather one in which people are making their life, which then could use certain kinds of strengthening rather than an obliteration replacement. And that such places should not be knocked down and rebuilt into mid-20th century modernist housing estates, however well-intentioned, but rather the kind of lives and livelihoods that people have put together can be enhanced through guarantee of things like clean water, adequate power, and other social goods that then enable people in their communities to flourish and grow in such a way that is not necessarily functional for capitalism. And that even if we might agree that a central contradiction is produced by the dynamics of capitalism saving capitalism from capitalism, that doesn't mean that there aren't billions of the billions of us on this planet not making livings and making lives that are maybe just a little below. So they're not necessarily anti-capitalist, but they're not making capitalism either. And that is something else that can be enhanced. So that, kind of comes back to the concept of abolition geography. Because abolition, in my way of thinking, has got to be green. To be green, it's got to be red. And to be red, it's got to be international. So if people are already doing their possibilities for growing these rehearsals without thinking, oh, the only way for us to remedy the wrongs of the world is to devolve into the smallest possible units and put up barriers around ourselves and say, okay, so mutual aid, key, self-organization, key, but it's the barrier that worries. So those are contradictions we still are constantly trying to work out over and over and over again.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been really great for me to try to think through again. I'm always happy to do that.